Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Round 8 of the FIDE Grand Swiss. Every day there seems to be stories. Less stories today, but still some exciting games to look at. We have the world champion versus the World Cup winner, and try explain that in any other sport. We've got intense battles near the top of the leaderboard, prodigies fighting all over the place, on the board, not physically, that I'm aware of. Maybe there were some fisticuffs that I'm not aware of. And it's just game after game. Today quieter than some of the others, but still lots to get into. So we can stop the slideshow, and we can get the window capture on, because we have to look at where else can we start. Oh, you're not supposed to see that. This is going great so far. Hello everybody. If you're not new to the channel, you've seen me stuff like this before. If you're new to the channel, it happens occasionally. The world champion, Gukesh, and then the World Cup winner, Divya, who's having a fantastic tournament. She's up 15 rating points before this game. She probably would have more now, provided she doesn't lose. And our world champion is very much out of sorts. E4, and Divya plays C5. She plays the Sicilian defense, and it's a very fighting opening. Gukesh goes for a bishop b5, the Rossolimo. We get e5, short castles, bishop to e7, rook to e1, knight to d4. This has all been played before, although Gukesh seems to be out of his prep just a little bit. Bishop drops back to c4. Knight takes f3, queen f3, knight to f6, and then here d3. Now, on some engines, this is given an inaccuracy. Not on mine at the moment. But one of my viewers, hopefully a subscriber, left a comment on the previous day's play. And he brought up some good points about engine analysis. And I use it a lot when I talk about these videos. So, let me talk for 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Hopefully not much longer than that. And then we'll get back to the game. Engine analysis is so interesting because, like, at the moment, it'll say plus 0.4. But after black plays one of their preferred moves, the evaluation changes and might be less favorable for white. So the way engines evaluate it is a lot different than when it actually gets played, and their depth is not always completely correct. We'll get into that more in another day. Just some food for thought. Anyway, short castles. Knight to c3, developing the knight. d6, a4, taking space. Bishop to e6, and now h3, and I've got one game left in the database, featuring Alexandra Gorietrika, the other lady in the open section, but this was played in 2013, so the players very much now got their own game. Queen to d7, a5, just taking more space on the queen side. Rook a8, bishop to d2, h6, queen e2, knight e8, and here Gukesh is slightly better. If he plays a very fascinating move, he has to play a6, is what the engine says, to disrupt all of this or to force this pawn to move. The thing is with a6, right, you've got a couple options. You can play b6, or you can't play b5 because you lose the pawn. You can take, but that allows the rook in, and then you create yourself a target because the rooks will double and the pawn will come under fire. So b6 is the best move. And now the follow-up is actually bishop to b5. This fascinating idea, because you get something like queen c8, and now you play in the center with d5. And if, for example, bishop takes, pawn takes, well then you can get your bishop in there, and it can't be removed unless you somehow maneuver the knight to get there. And it's just this pawn creating problems. You can reinforce it, and it's a better position for Gukesh. He goes for a different plan, which is not bad, but a different plan, and he plays f4. The problem is, this allows black to respond. E takes f4, bishop takes f4, and now bishop to f6. e5 now launching forward, but d takes e5, bishop takes, and we trade off the bishops. But queen d4 check forces the queens off the board, and after knight to e4, this is a very level endgame. So this is going to take some serious effort from Gukesh if he would like to press for a win. He does find this a6 idea, and he is now better. but b6 comes, and you maybe don't have the firepower as we trade bishops. So now the material is completely equal. It is the pawn structure that's going to make the difference. We've got a 3-on-2 for black on the king side, and a 4-on-3 for white on the king side. On the queen side, rather. Let me take a sip of water to make sure I can talk properly. Not sponsored, it's just water. Rook d7. Now, this allows infiltration, but we get knight d5, rook d6, knight c4, rook d7, and we could get a repetition here, but no. Gukesh brings the king. Knight to c7, rook to e5, rook to c8, and now we begin this phase of the game, where black is trying to make use of the fact that this is a weakness for white, and they promptly win it, but white's able to activate. And even though black is slightly better here, it's a difficult endgame practically, as we now trade pawns, and it looks like it is probably going to be headed for a draw as the pawns begin to liquidate. But both sides have a 3-on-1, black on the king side and white on the queen side. So this game is not over. Both sides can very much push. The engine is 0-0-0. We've just gone past move 40, so they've got their extra time. This endgame is going to take some winning for somebody, and you're going to need a devastating mistake. We trade now, so it's a 2-1-0 for white on the queen side. But the pawns are far more central, and now black has a 3-0. So it is going to be very difficult for Gukesh, and after rook to b6, he's worse. In fact, he's losing. If, and only if, Divya Deshmukh plays g6. Reason being, you can play a knight d6 check, and king e7, and knight to e4. And this is just better because you've got something like knight e6 check, and now the king has to make a bold decision. If you play king to c4, then you've got h5. And this is very problematic for Gukesh. Unfortunately for Divya Deshmukh, she mixes up the move order and plays knight to e6 check first. But now king c4 is not as much of a problem. You haven't built this up yet with g6 and then h5. So now knight to f4, but we take the pawn with check before we give ours up, and now we can swing the rook over. And this is once again a draw, and it was a draw for much while longer, as there was a threat of both losing rooks. Check. And now this is the endgame. And this endgame should be comfortably a draw. There's one pawn left. There are times when you can sack the knight for it, but the easiest thing to do is to trade the rooks, and then you sack the knight for it first. If you sack the knight with the rook still on the board, there are chances that black still goes on to win the game. But you lose the knight, but now we trade rooks. Rook a6. White's going to continue to play this. Even though the pawn's still on the board, I've got a knight. So black loses their knight because they think they have a draw. Now Divya Deshmukh is going to have to defend this because Gukesh, who's struggling for rhythm and struggling for form, is going to play this endgame out. He keeps his rook on the board, threatens various mating attacks, trying to find a way through. There is a way to hold this, and Divya knows it, but Gukesh is going to test her technique, and it is a difficult endgame with the pawn still marching down the board when it can, but eventually the pawn is won. And now this should be a draw, but as I said, Gukesh will test the technique of Divya Deshmukh as he tries and tries and tries and tries, and he continues all the way. 6 hours of play this game was. Divya Deshmukh defending this endgame tenaciously, but Gukesh was going to keep pressing. The problem is your king's always exposed, and there are ways to defend, and after 103 moves, king to d4 was played, and the game was declared a draw. So a fantastic hold from Divya Deshmukh. She did miss a chance, but it's not an easy chance, and it wasn't something that everybody would find. Now, there are a few games we need to look at, one of whom is this man, this young man. Yagiz Erdogmus from Turkey versus Levon Aronian, probably one of the most informed chess players in the world right now. Having a quiet tournament, Levon, actually, by his standards, considering how well he's been playing, he plays a French defense. I love seeing the French defense. It was one of the first openings I learned with black. I love seeing it played at top level. And we get knight to c3, the classical variation. And bishop to b4, win now. Whenever you see a 1 hour, it's going to be fireworks. E5, C5, bishop to D2, knight to E7, A3, bishop takes, and now B6. So not the poison pawn, not something extravagant, but something still very interesting. H4, bishop to A6, and we trade off, and now we play H5. All been played before. The games in the database are dodgy, but all been played before. White is going to attack on the king side, and, nothing signals that more than G4. So Levon's got himself in a tricky position, right? Because you can castle short, because you can no longer castle long, but you're going to be under attack. So probably the best thing to do is keep the king in the center, which is very difficult. But when you crack open, White's going to have to castle eventually. They can't also keep the king in the center. So what's going to unfold is a very complicated but very interesting endgame. Middle game, rather, not endgame. Queen d7, bishop to d2. Now looking to support g5. We take in the center, and now bishop to b4. Very interesting play here from Erdogmus. Rook c4, and rook g1. So probably no castling for him either. Knight a6, b3, kicks out the rook. Danger levels, d3, attacks the queen. We take with the pawn, but now the rook slides back. And you might say, well, I don't understand that. Why would you just give up a pawn? You give up the pawn because you were a pawn up. But now this structure is split, and you have a completely open c-file. So if you castle, there is potential to double the rooks. But we first go back with rook to c8. Now bishop to d6, you just put that bishop on a good square. It's the only bishop on the board. Knight to c5, and now b4, because the pawn was under attack. Knight moves to the center of the board. Now it's looking to come in towards your territory. You don't like that. So queen d2. f6, knight to h4. You push that pawn forward. It no longer defends that square. I'm going to jump in there. I don't mind if you take this, because my bishop takes and puts pressure on that. And here there was a move played that I could not believe. In this position, Levon Aronian on move 22 played short castles, and is now worse. Levon Aronian is worse because he played short castles. Bishop takes e7, we snap off the knight, and we plant our own knight with a fork. It looks bad for black, but actually you can get away with it, because we have to play king f1, otherwise there are infiltrations here. And now you've got the chance to move your rook to f7. You might say, wait, hang on a minute, why can't I just take this? Because queen takes e5 is devastating, because it's a fork, and there's nothing you can do. You can play this, I take, so you can't take right away. Just showing that for clarification. So queen c7, we move the king out the way, now we move the rook out the way, so spotting that nicely. Rook e1 now, queen to c2, offering a queen trade, is worse for Levon Aronian. It's losing, in fact. Queen takes c2, rook takes c2 is losing because of the absolutely unbelievable e takes f6, rook takes f6, and now you simply play f4. And the engine says, white's better, you just play f4. Yeah, just push the pawn in front of your king. Sure. Okay, queen c2 was played, and Erdogmus finds a better idea. He plays rook e2, which loses all of his advantage, but it's fine, because you trade on your terms. But now rook c3 comes in, and Levon Aronian is creating counterplay. He's not going to just die on his sword. We play king to g2, but rook takes a3 is a bit too much, because now rook e1. And knight to c3, and now rook c2, which is an accuracy, but I'm ignoring it. d4 so locks the knight in, but maybe that's over too much, because now e takes f6, rook takes f6. I can just play rook e4. Sacrificing the rook, just by the way, because if you take this, it's mate in 3, because it's check, and if king here, you just get mated in 1, and then obviously if king here, you get mated in 1. You would have to block with the rook. So a beautiful, just out of nowhere, rook e4 knight sacrifice, rook sacrifice. e5 gets played to now kind of avoid mate, but it doesn't, because I just play rook takes e5. You just give me the pawn, and now a5, but rook e8 check. King comes up, check. king drops back. You might say, wait, hang on, I thought you said this was mate. Yeah, in a different position when the pawn was still here. If you remember, that's why e5 was played. That was the idea, so that the king has breathing room and can escape to that square. So rook e7 check, king drops back, and now b takes a5, rook takes a5, rook e8 check, king drops up, check, here. We just play these so we can get a bit of time on the clock and figure out how to get through this. Look at the time, by the way. Erdogmus has 1 minute and 24 seconds. Levon Aronian, who is worse, has 50 minutes on the clock. If you're going to lose quickly. Rook d7. Now, can he find the way through? Because this is not clear at all. Because, remind you, this is a problem. And this knight's actually pretty well placed. And it's anchored in here. As long as this can be defended. It can't be. b5. So rook takes. Now the knight's hanging. But we defend it. And when the rook drops back, we bring king h8. King to h7. So the question is, which of these two knights is better? And how do you coordinate the rooks in such a way that you have an advantage? Because now white has this pass pawn, as this one's coming down the board. So black has counterplay. That is the most difficult thing. Black also has this fork, low-key. So that'll probably need to be defended. It is, because of rook to d8. Rook takes g6. We sacrifice the rook. Because takes, king takes, and now we just have rook e1. Rook a7, check. Here. And now look at this. We're hunting down all the pawns. King comes forward, g6, and rook d6. And that is the end of the game. Erdogmus defeats Levon Aronian. Levon Aronian resigns because these pawns are going to fall. This pawn cannot be defended, and the king is coming to evict the knight and to blockade this. And these two rooks are too powerful, and your knight is not strong enough to defend against both of them. What a fantastic game he played. It was really, really fantastic. Another game that I really, really was looking forward to was this one. Hans Niemann. He won yesterday to bring himself closer to candidates' contention. He has the dream of becoming the second American world champion after Bobby Fischer. He's playing Alireza Firouzja, who's had a quiet tournament himself. e4, e5, knight f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. Spanish. a6, bishop to a5, knight to f6. So a mainline Spanish. Like, I can just click the forward arrow for a bit, because unfortunately the Spanish is well explored. And Firouzja chooses this system with knight to c3. The reason I mention that is because in some Spanish positions what you'll play is c3. And then you'll use this knight maneuver to kind of get your knight over to the king side. Knight to c3 is played when you're really looking for control over this. This is often because the bishop will be placed on this diagonal. So that's one of the ways to play the Spanish. Sometimes the bishop drops here if the knight goes there after then allowing c5. Just some Spanish knowledge. If you want to know more, I've got a video about it. Anyway, bishop to g4 pins the knight. We just ignore it for now. Bishop to e3. Knight to d4. Now, what are you doing about that pin? So bishop takes, pawn takes. Now we jump the knight in. What are you doing about the pin? Knight takes d5, bishop takes. We slide the rook over. Now h3 and trade. So what's emerged here? And there are still games in the database, but this is practically a new game. And Hans Niemann had to think. We've got opposite colored bishops, right? In all endgames, this is probably a draw. But while there are still the heavy pieces in play to be had, this favors the attacking side, the side that can seize the initiative. And you've got two very dynamic players here. So it's going to be a very interesting fight as they both kind of look for the initiative. We get some pawn jostling on the queen side. The rooks infiltrate for Alireza, but Hans defends. And, you know, this is kind of Hans Niemann maybe not playing in his traditional style as we get a pawn trade in the center. Hans gives up the pawn but blocks with the bishop and gets a pawn back after firstly moving the rook. h5. G takes h5, and now we secure everything with c3, queen g4, and we trade the queens. That's not what you wanted to see, and unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, there's not much more I can tell you because rook e1 was played, and then b4, and they shook hands, and this game ends in a draw. And this is kind of what you get. When you get this kind of structure, this is how the Spanish can end sometimes. It is still a very dynamic opening, but just the way this was handled, there's not much they could do. Immovable force meets unstoppable unstoppable force meets immovable object. Let me get the phrasing right there. And just two players who couldn't really afford to lose, but didn't have to win. So sometimes you will get games like this. Whew. But there was one win, one solitary win in the top 8 boards, and it was in this game. Vidit Gujrathi versus Vincent Keymer. Vincent's got the white pieces, e4, e5, knight f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. That's why I started with the Hans Niemann game. It was a Spanish. Here we have another Spanish. But we get what Vidit Gujrathi plays all the time, knight to f6, the Berlin defense. Now, the question is, will Vincent Keymer castle and allow the Berlin endgame, or will he play an anti-Berlin? He plays an anti-Berlin. Bishop to c5, and now an early capture of the knight, which is interesting. Sometimes you want to keep that bishop around a bit longer, but Vincent Keymer seems to know what he's doing as they play a bit more theory, as they develop their pieces. They see space on the queen side. Now, with this capture, what it does mean is you can't really control d5, but Black themselves can't put the pawn in the center. So their play in terms of pawns comes on the queen side and can still come in terms of f5. But it's really down to White to say, what am I going to do? I've given up my light squared bishop. Black has the bishop pair. So how am I going to neutralize that? You want to keep pawns on the board. You want to really use your knights. So let's see. b6 is played. Now knight to e3, looking to get to f5. Bishop takes e3. We're like, we don't need you to get to f5. I will give up my bishop pair and give you this. Now we've got opposite colored bishops on the board, which could be relevant in endgames. c5. Knight to d2, bishop to b7, and now b3. Queen to e6, and we drop the knight back, and we rotate it to g3. Where again, we're looking for that f5 square. That is the golden square for the white knight. But Black plays f5 themselves, giving up a pawn, but not really, because e takes f6, hits the queen, but now rook takes. A flat-out rook sacrifice because you cannot take it. You might say, why? If you take, you hang mate. So you're not really sacrificing the rook. h3, queen to c6, threatening mate. You just play f3. But rook f6, you might be tempted to sack the rook, but because queen takes, you can't sack just yet. So rook f6 first. Now bishop to d2. Rook to g6 targets the knight. I just play king to h2. And Vincent Keymer has all the defensive resources to keep the position balanced. So, after we give up the bishop for the knight, now Black went from having 2 bishops to having no bishops. Now we've got knight versus bishop. And this structure is very interesting because Black's now committed this h-pawn. They've only got this g-pawn. This rook is really well placed, but could become a target. This rook needs to swing in. The queen side's pretty locked in terms of the way they've put the pawns. The center and the queen side's pretty locked. So all the play is going to come down here, you would imagine, for the time being. Unless one of these players finds a brilliant idea. So we get rook f8. Rook f3 now, looking to trade rooks and control the f-file. h4. h4 is a very clever idea. Now, White is better, but the initiative firmly lies with Vidit Gujrathi. Why is this a good idea? Because you clamp down on the king's escape squares and you can launch a rook onto that square. But queen e2, rook takes, queen takes, and now knight f8, seeking to bring the knight to a beautiful e6 square from where it can go to either this golden d4 square or the golden f4 square. So you will probably have to play bishop here and then take when the knight arrives. Rook c1. Rook c1 for me is an interesting move. I don't understand why you wouldn't play rook f1 or rook g1. Those kind of make more sense to me. I mean, rook d1 also maybe. But rook f1 or rook g1 seem more natural to me if you're going to move the rook. You can also play king h1 to just kind of get off this vague diagonal. Rook c1, not the best move, and the engine thinks, nah, it's probably level. You've lost your advantage, you've wasted a move. Now the knight comes in, now we play queen h5, which hits the rook. But just knight to f4. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and now a beautiful idea, e5. Queen c6, and now we play rook g1. See, why did we play rook c1 when the rook was going to go there? Rook lands on g3, as I predicted earlier, but now we give up the h4 pawn. We play g5, but now the queen gets in. And probably this game will end by perpetual check. But I have already told you, this game does not end by perpetual check. King g7, we defend perpetual check, but now h4 ourselves. queen g6, and we trade. And this game will be settled in a rook endgame by rook e1, rook e3, and this game will not just be settled in a rook endgame, it will be settled in a king and pawn endgame. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to look at the board. I'm looking at it. I hope you're looking at it. Don't look at me. I know I got a haircut and I look really good. You can tell me about it in the comments, but look at the board. How do you play this endgame? Because I would look at this from the white side. I'm looking at it from Vincent Keymer's point of view. I'm like, oh my gosh. Black's 2 squares away from queening. This pawn's coming in. The black king's going to come in. I've completely forgotten that this pawn is 3 squares away. I'm just discounting it. I'm like, I've got this nice structure, but I can't get through, and these pawns are going to come down the board. And then we flip the board around, and you look at this from Black's perspective, you're like, the white king is just going to come and win my pawn, and then this pawn's going to promote. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I flip the board back, who's winning this? The engine thinks it's 0-0-0. How? So, king g1. This game is on a knife's edge. King g6. King f1. King f5, king e2, king takes e5, king takes e3. You know what's funny? This position is like a stalemate. Because why? The kings are in opposition. Now both sides are going to look to find waiting moves, because the moment you go one way, I go the other, it probably doesn't work. So if you play, for example, king to f3, it's Black's move. It's Black to move. So let's say Black makes a waiting move. They play like something like g4. I've got bad news for you. If you're supporting Vidit Gujrathi, he only has one move in this position. It's a king move, right? Where can the king go? The king has got 5 possible moves. If you're only looking at the king, because unfortunately g4 loses because I just played g3. G4 loses, yeah, because you play g3. And this pawn will be won very quickly, and then this pawn will promote. Or it will be used as a decoy while I run that way. So g4, g3 doesn't work. The only holding move is to play king to d5. Why? Because normally in opposition, the white king would want to go here. It can't because of the pawn. That's also why you can't play g4. So that's the only holding move. Now white would have to play c3, and then Black can play c6. And then I can play king e2, and now you can play g4 because you would be taking away that square, and either the king would have to go up or sideways, or there's a couple of holding moves. So king to d5 is the holding move. Unfortunately, as you've probably suspected, he doesn't, and he plays c6 too early. But why that's a problem is because I can play c4 now. And now there is no breakthrough because I take twice and I promote. And while your king goes to run there, my king gets in. King f5 now is devastating because I've got king f3. King f6, I come in. And Vincent Keymer plays this king and pawn endgame as well as he can. It was handed to him by a mistake. Look at that, sacrificing the pawn. So the black king has to move away, and now we feast on everything. And Vincent Keymer wins. He trades down the pawns. And even though he ends up down a pawn because he sacrificed one, he queens first. And g2 is not fast enough because of queen to a7. And after king to h2 threatening promotion, you've got queen f2 pinning the pawn. A beautiful technique in the queen versus king endgame as we give check, forcing the king in front of the pawn, and king to c3. Anytime you move out the way, I will pin it to you, and I will bring my king closer, and I will mate you. And that is how the game ended, and what a game it was. Otherwise, there were draws all over. The two leaders played each other, Nihal, Sarin, and Matthias Bluebaum. They did play each other. The game ended after 21 moves. Knight to f6. This is what the position looked like. So they traded like almost nothing. They've traded a set of minor pieces. All the major pieces still in there. 21 moves. Not much to say. There was no need for either of them to take risk. So the standings. Because there was a draw, as you know, in Hans Niemann, Alireza Firouzja. Let me just put the slideshow back on so that when I'm doing the timestamps, it's easier. Anyway, A draw on the top board between Nihal, Sarin, and Matthias, Bluebaum. A draw between Hans Niemann and Alireza Firouzja. A draw between Nordebek Abdusatorov and Aminbaidu Mishra. A draw between Anish Giri and Parham Magsudlu. A win for Vincent Keymer over Vidit Gujrathi. Draw between Parag Dhananda and Ricard Rapport. Draw between Arjun Erigaisi and his opponent. And draw between Yanni Pomniche and Pranav V. And then a win for Jorden van Foreest. So the standings are incredibly close. I'm going to read you the top 10. Top 2 players are on 6 points. That is Matthias Bluebaum and Nihal Sarin. So currently, if the tournament ended today, they qualify for the candidates. But there are 3 rounds to go. Next, which is all tied for second, anybody can break out from here, all on 5.5 points. Aminbaidu Mishra, Parham Magsudlu, Alireza Firouzja, Nordebek Abdusatorov, Vincent Keymer, Hans Niemann, Anish Giri, and Jorden van Foreest. Incredible. And I mean, there's a chasing pack all on 5. That's another 14 players. All of whom, if they go on a run and win 3 games in a row, could be in contention at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, tell me in the comments, who's going to win this thing? Because I have no idea. Someone could have a great game tomorrow. Someone could have a terrible game tomorrow. I've got no idea. All I know is I'm enjoying this so much. And I hope you are too.